My name's Ash, and welcome to Paved with Gold, the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast. I want to acknowledge the traditional landowners on which I am recording, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's here, finally, the episode many have been waiting for. Today, we're going to be talking about neurodivergence and eating disorders, and what a time to do so, because I have some news, guys, as I'm sure it will come to a shock to absolutely everybody. Sarcasm. I have recently been diagnosed with ADHD. I know, clutch those pearls. At the age of 32 years old, I've finally got an explanation as to why my brain operates the way that it does. And it has been a mix of emotions, to be honest. It's been joy, it's been relief, smugness, frustration, grief for what potentially could have been if I'd been diagnosed earlier, a whole range of things. So I'm particularly excited to talk about this today. And the reason why this episode is so in such high demand is because, and I'm sure we'll get into it, there's a really high prevalence of eating disorders amongst neurodivergent folk. Purely anecdotally speaking here, the majority of the guests on this podcast have been neurodivergent. So at least our very small sample size is aligning to what we're starting to see. So we thought that this was a very important topic to discuss. And to help me do that, we have an incredible guest. And I know I say that every single time, but we really do have some incredible guests on this podcast. I feel very lucky. So today's guest is an accredited dietitian specializing in pediatrics and eating disorders who has a lived experience with neurodivergency as an autistic ADHDer and as well as a lived experience with an eating disorder. They are a PhD candidate and senior teaching fellow at Bond University and former deputy chair of Eating Disorder Neurodiversity Australia. I am so excited to have Anna Rose join us today. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Ash. I'm really, really excited for our conversation. It's an honor to be here. And I agree, like I've listened to some of your previous podcasts and you do have amazing guests on here. And I've always learned something. So I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation and super excited to find out more about your journey and how, your recent, I guess, identification as an ADHDer formally.
Yes, formally.
is working out for you.
Yeah, it's actually because of this podcast, I think, that really sort of opened my eyes to the fact that I am ADHD. Mainly Callie, who'll probably be nodding along and be like, yeah, I told you so. Actually, she's told me that already. It's like, yeah, like I knew it. Everyone knew it. I thought you were this whole time. So yeah, it's just realizing and hearing other people's lived experience, which again is why we go on about this all the time, of me picking up on a few things. I'm like, okay, there might be something here. Let's look into it, shall we? And I know that people can sort of self-identify and self-diagnose, but I also just wanted that diagnosis from a doctor to be like, because I've been diagnosed with things like depression and generalized anxiety disorder, but then medications like SSRIs have never worked for me. And I guess for reasons, like obvious reasons. And like it was, all of those are just underlying symptoms of a core problem, which was my brain chemistry is just slightly different and my executive functioning is off. So that's why.
Yes, exactly. And I think that that's like what you've highlighted there, that sharing of experience, like it's really increased, I think, in recent years because of social media, but it's so important for people to make sense of their own experiences that we share this information. Like this is how we create and share meaning and knowledge. So you're right, like sharing lived experience is critical.
Yeah. And also I think, neurodivergence operates absolutely on a spectrum. And there are some people who, like, because sometimes you say, oh, I'm not the typical boy in school who's hyperactive and is always disrupting class, because that's the stereotype, right? And women and girls it manifests completely differently, and that's why there are so many women who are being diagnosed later in life, because we just got missed. And
100%.
And then of course like gender non-conforming folk as well. It's just there's been a lot of discovery over the last few years.
Yeah, and actually, like I think that to be completely fair, like I know a lot of like people who were assigned male at birth or who identify as male, like they have like a certain profile of neurodivergence seems to have been missed as well for for them. So, yeah, it's really interesting to see how our, I guess, understanding of what neurodivergence can look like has shifted, and it's moving beyond the stereotypes, which was so limiting, I think, for
Absolutely.
people getting the right support.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's dive in, shall we? Because
We
some,
should dive in. Look, we've gone on a rabbit hole, a
some,
tangent
I
already.
know something tells me that this is going to be full of like tangents because we love it.
Yeah.
But yes, so as we often do, let's start off by talking about your lived experience and where this all started for you, both obviously from birth as a neurodivergent person, but also your lived experience with an eating disorder. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. And I was saying before to Ash, just before you hit record, that I've never actually told this story in its entirety. So, wish me luck in getting this out coherently.
You'll be fine. Again, we've heard that so many times on this podcast. It's like, yeah, I've never talked about this. Well, perfect time to do
Yeah,
it.
like little pieces here and there, but yeah, my therapist, like they know, but like maybe I've never done eating disorder therapy, so there
Share
we
as
go.
much or as little as you'd like.
Yes, so I guess maybe a good place to start is, I guess, the family that I was born into. So my parents um, were older. So my dad was 60 when I was born, and my mum was 42.
Okay.
So they were older parents, and I was the youngest of three. My eldest brother has cerebral palsy and an intellectual disability. We were all 2 years apart, so my mum was really busy. But the family I grew up in was extremely religious, and I think that it's might seem insignificant to most people, but I guess it has a part in my eating disorder journey.
I wouldn't
So
say it's
extremely,
insignificant. I would
yeah,
say,
yeah, but I guess like it's like, oh, it's a random thing to start with.
but like
But
religious trauma is absolutely a thing, especially if people don't share those views the same way today.
yes, the religious trauma features. It has a little spotlight.
Yes.
Um, and I guess what's really interesting though is that the food environment that I was brought up in was what we would now consider probably like almost close to ideal. It was very responsive. Like yes, we weren't made special meals, or special preferences weren't accommodated, but we also weren't. There was no punitive measures taken if we didn't want to eat. We could eat whatever we liked. We could, like, there was all types of food available in our house at all times. We were very food secure. There was no diet talk. There was no dieting behavior. There was no body like talk at all.
Oh, wow.
At
Okay.
all. So I think that that's, I guess sits counter to some of the stereotypes that we have around why people might be developing an eating disorder. And as well, like this is pre-social media, so there was none of that influence at
Oh,
all.
I miss those
I did
times.
have like Dolly magazine
Oh,
and
yeah.
the Kate Moss era.
Oh, yes. Heroin chic has a lot to answer for, guys.
Exactly. So there was that. Um, but I would have to say that when I reflect back on my time at home up until I left home when I was 18, the food environment was what I would say was ideal in terms of what we would recommend now for supporting someone to have a healthy relationship with their body and with food. But that still wasn't enough to stop me going on to develop an eating disorder. Um, and I think that what happened next is like when I was, because my parents were so religious and I was always the difficult child in the family. I was the one that spoke their mind. I was the one that called bullshit. I had a really big like bugbear about like hypocrisy and also misogyny that I saw in their church. And I didn't have very good impulse control around saying what I thought. Oh, and also I was just very like strong-willed, I think was the term.
I'm nodding because
And
I can
so
relate a lot here.
yeah, and so I think I had this almost juxtaposed position in my family where I did really, really well at school without necessarily trying that hard. And I was a good kid in many ways. I just played a lot of sport, but at the same time, I was stubborn and argumentative and didn't agree with everything that they said. And so I kind of also held this problem child position in the family. And my brothers were quite compliant and preferred to keep the peace rather than to speak their mind. Um, yes, and so by the time I was, my parents were also quite strict. And so by the time I was 17, when I graduated high school, I was very much into partying. And I would go out clubbing and party hard all weekend, but it actually ended up becoming quite a thing where I'd go out for like say 4 nights of the weekend
Yeah.
and party. And and during this time I became skinnier, like I lost weight, but unintentional, and I actually had no hang-ups around my body at all. Like um, I was naturally had thin privilege, and I think that I just didn't, it didn't really register for me at all. Um, and then, so yes, I did that for quite a while, but then I decided I wanted to go to Canada and go snowboarding. So off I went, took myself 18 to Canada to go snowboarding. I lived there for 18 months. And while I was there, I did what everyone does in Canada in the snow. I snowboarded all day, and at night I would either work and I worked in like a pizza restaurant, and I've worked in like a retail, like a snowboarding shop. But I'd also party and like drink beer and eat poutine, which is like the fries with the cheese and gravy on it.
It's so good. Oh my God.
And I know, so good. And like pizza and all those delicious things. And so so yeah, so I was just living my best life over there, having a great time. I did have a boyfriend over there that was older than me and was actually quite abusive, and so I did, yeah, have, I guess, some challenges there. But when I was, before I'd left for Canada, I had, so I was like 18, I was working a job trying to save some money to go overseas, and I was an undiagnosed ADHDer and very impulsive, but also autistic, and didn't, like, my communication skills were such that I had a really hard time, and it's something I've had to work on, is knowing how to say no, or knowing how to say I've changed my mind and I don't want to do that thing that I impulsively agreed to do. Anyway, so while I was working, I was invited to do a magazine article with a guy from work. His girlfriend started working for this national magazine, a new one, like kind of like Dolly style or Cleo. And they wanted to interview couples about their relationship. I agreed, thinking, yeah, that sounds fun. Anyway, uh, I regretted it as soon as I did it, but didn't know how to get out of it. And so I went through with it, and the boy I was seeing at the time and myself were interviewed. We talked all about our sex life because oversharing is a thing I didn't really understand. And they took photos of us in our lingerie and all this kind of stuff. Lingerie I wouldn't even wear normally.
Yeah.
But anyway, did it, went overseas, forgot all about it.
Uh,
Literally forgot all about it. And then one day I woke up to a letter from my parents with some, like, a photocopied like copy of the article, and basically this letter just saying how ashamed they were of me and how disgusting it was and how disappointing it was, and how could I do this to them? But, all the things
yeah.
that would come from a very strict religious, I guess, mindset around when they see this behavior. And so I guess that for me an important thing, because I felt an incredible amount of shame around that, and also confusion at why I'd agreed to do something when actually, like, my values are that I wouldn't ever intentionally hurt someone in that way. And yes, my parents kind of, the way I interpreted it was like I felt disowned. Like I wanted to go home, and my dad had a heart attack. They said, don't come home. You're not our daughter. Like, our daughter wouldn't behave like this, blah, blah. Anyway, that was probably the thing that triggered one of the first, like, I guess, major depression episodes for me, or really big shifts for me in the way I thought about myself. Um, and anyway, so left that boyfriend, he got he went a bit crazy, started stalking me and all this kind of stuff. But anyway,
Oh, fun.
got away, and as you do.
Mm, great.
And I eventually had to come home, and I came home. I would have been 20 by this stage, and I had decided to go to university and do a business degree. And part of this in my mind, I can look back and see, was that I wanted to please my parents again. I felt very, at like, I guess, lost at sea connection wise in what had happened, and I wanted to go home and repair. And so I went home, got into business at UTS, and went back to live at home. And it was just such a big shift for me to have gone from living this, really fun, incredibly, it was just a great life,
Mm.
to being back home with very strict parents and studying university and being at home again. And
Like more
all my
expectations
friends
after expectations and needing to, yeah.
expectations, but all my friends had left and gone overseas. So they'd done it opposite to me. They'd done uni and then gone overseas, whereas I'd gone overseas and then come back to do uni. And so I was very lonely and isolated. And while I had been overseas, I'd actually gained some weight. So when I'd left Australia, I remember I was heroin chic
Uh.
accidentally, and I came back looking quite healthy, healthy. I'm going to say
In air quotes.
like inverted air quotes, thank you. Um, and I was not even aware of my change in my body. Like I just was quite disconnected from my body, I felt like.
Do you think that could possibly be like, especially in Canada in winter in the snow, everyone's all like rugged up anyway, so there's
Hmm.
less focus on people's bodies?
I think that that's part of it as well. Like, and I was just busy having fun. Like,
Yeah.
I just wasn't focused on it, and nor had I ever been up until that point.
Yeah.
And maybe there's like some interoception stuff in that as well. Like, my mind was busy with other things.
Mm.
But everyone started commenting on my appearance and saying things like, I do remember my mum saying, like, you look so healthy, because I was upset about something, and she's like, but you look so healthy. And and I just heard, like,
Mm.
you're fat. And in that moment, it's not that I concretely thought that was the truth. It was simply that was like just merged with my distress of being isolated and displaced and not having my identity. Like, it felt like I'd lost my identity, very much so,
Mm.
coming back home. And so I was like, oh, I'll just start running. I didn't like running really, but it was like a form of self-punishment. I look back now and I'd see how far I could go or how fast I could do this certain section. And it just became like this personal challenge, right, to run. And then I started cutting out food, and it literally crept up on me, like, in that way, which I think is quite a common
Mm.
experience. So yes, whilst it was triggered by a comment around my body shape. Um, it it was actually like the function of it was to give me something to control and focus on, because everything else felt so out of control. Yes, and it also, I think, reflecting back, it served a purpose to um, keep me well behaved. Yeah, so keep me focused and contained. And I feel like an eating disorder kind of restricted, like the restrictive, so my eating disorder was very restrictive, kind of orthorexia nervosa. I think at some stages I probably would have met criteria for anorexia nervosa, but no one ever diagnosed me, and I never saw any help around it. There's too much shame around it, and also a lot of self-denial
Mm.
for the large part of it. Yeah, and so it kind of helped me with manage my ADHD symptoms, if I'm completely honest. So it contained my hyperactivity. It helped me process time in a more neurotypical way,
Mm.
because everything revolved around eating occasions. So I suddenly had a way to mark and keep time in my day to contain my hyperactivity and my impulsivity, because I was just so focused on this one thing. So it was literally, my life was study and food and eating and exercise.
Mm.
So yeah. So that went on for a long time. I graduated, did finance, I graduated, worked as a financial controller, hated it, and it did as every ADHD it does. and I fled. I quit and fled, and I went to Mexico. Just
Look,
went
it makes
surfing in
sense.
Mexico, as you do. And then I spent like 9 months surfing and traveling through Mexico and Central America, um, and South America. And during that time, my eating disorder was really, really at its worst,
Mm,
because I was exercising so much and unable to really eat um, enough of the foods that I had available there. And I had a lot of time on my hands, and yeah, it was not, it was, I look back at that time and it was not, not good, not good at all.
mm.
Yeah, and so then I decided when I was finished that, I was like, I'm going to be a dietitian because let's talk about how many people enter dietetics with an eating disorder or disordered eating. The
Yeah,
rates are high,
yeah.
high, high, high.
Again, purely anecdotally here, when I was inpatient, I had so many people who were in that sort of early, like between high school and university, or they're in university and they're like, oh, I want to study to be a dietitian. Because I
Mm,
think there's a focus, like you're so like hyper fixated on food, that's all you can think about. I even thought, oh, I want to go and be a personal trainer instead, and give up all the 4 years of study I've just done, and then yeah. So
totally,
it's a big
exactly
thing.
that. Exactly. I actually looked into personal training too
Yeah.
at one stage. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Because I love the gym.
Yeah, we all loved
That
the
was
gym.
another part of my eating disorder was going to the gym a lot. But yeah, so I studied to be a dietitian. I did the 4 year undergrad program, and it wasn't until I was in and you've probably heard, I think, in previous guests share, like a lot of the curriculum is very healthist and very orthorexic, kind of, I guess, in the messaging.
And white.
And white, yeah, yeah, it's very, very colonial mindset, like very, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I guess that suited me at the time because I was like, I'm so good at controlling
Mm.
my food and eating. Like, I can share this knowledge with everyone. So it's almost like this savior complex that I had at that time, and which is awful, embarrassing to say, but like that is the reality of it. Is like I can actually support people to meet the guidelines because I'm good at this. Like I can do this, not realizing that there's a lot more to it as to why I was good at it and as to why other people might find things more
Yeah.
challenging.
It all makes sense. Everything you're saying makes sense. It
Hmm.
all, like, yeah, I can see
Yeah.
how you got there. Totally.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, but it was like my third year, I think, towards the end, we did an eating disorders lecture, and I was like, hmm, hmm. This is sounding a little bit familiar, some of these behaviors and these ways of thinking. But I always like, whilst I held this duality, like I could see that I was represented in some of this, but at the same time, the diagnostic categories, the stereotype behaviors and etiology and all that didn't make sense for me because I actually didn't like have this I think and now that I understand neurodivergence and autism and the way that our body image is experienced and the way that our sensory system interacts with our experience of body image and also for me I am non-binary, so I didn't realize at the time like me staying small and more androgynous looking, air quotes again, and not having a period for 10 to 12 years, like they were in alignment with me being non-binary. They were functional in that way. My body image is related to how I feel. So I wasn't looking in the mirror and saying, oh, I look a certain way. It would be how my body feels. So I feel uncomfortable moving through the world in this shape or with this piece of clothing touching my body in this way, and that is distressing. So if I ate a big meal, that feeling of bloating, like that was distressing. Um, Not because I thought about it in terms of my body weight, shape, or size, but in terms of the sensation of it.
Yeah. Completely.
And so I was trying to avoid that, if that makes sense. So anyway, I've gone on a bit of a tangent, but
No,
in the
again,
end,
all of this, I'm like nodding. I'm like, yep, that same. Yep, same. Yep.
yeah.
Why it took so long for me to freaking realize that I was ADHD. I'm like, okay.
Well, I think, yeah,
Yeah.
so much of it has only just come out in recent years,
Yeah.
to be more available knowledge and shared wisdom. but I think then I did realize, like after I graduated, that I had, disordered eating. At least I would admit to myself, but I would never admit that to anyone else because I was really afraid. I was afraid of the stigma. I didn't want to be. I didn't want that for myself. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I didn't. I was afraid of what other people would say and do, and how they would judge me as a professional.
Can I also ask, did you feel perhaps that you didn't want to potentially disappoint your parents again? Could that have played into it as well?
It's really interesting. I think to, I guess, maybe close the loop on like the parent part of it is like I had, so after I graduated from finance, I moved out of home again, um and I kind of had made peace with the fact that I was not going to be able to please my parents because I was never going to join their religion,
Right.
and that was their core disappointment when they thought of me, was
Gotcha.
that I was actively choosing to not join their faith and not follow them in their footsteps. And I kind of had to make peace with that, but the way that my brain made peace with it was through developing moral scrupulosity (OCD). So in my mind, I told myself, well, I may not be religious in the way that they want me to be, but I am a good person, and I am going to be the best person and live in line with all of the values I know to be morally, right, based on my belief system, and to be aligned with my values and to be ethically sound. And so it developed into a moral scrupulosity OCD, a little bit of like responsibility and harm OCD, just right OCD in there. So that then became the core driver, I would say, of my, well, alongside autism and ADHD, but like that was the core trauma driver, I guess, of my eating disorder.
Gotcha.
Yes, because you can be, perfect eating, just right eating. All of that got mixed into it.
Yeah.
So that's, I guess, the core, to kind of close the loop on like the parent religious trauma part of it.
Gotcha.
But they never, like a couple of times, they would be like a little indication, oh, maybe, they were a bit worried about what I was doing, like with my body and my eating, but there was never any awareness of what that could mean or what they needed to do for me, I guess.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it was just kind of, as everything in my family was, just brushed under the rug.
That
Won't worry
totally
about that
works,
one.
right? It totally works.
Yeah. Um, But that's why I went into pediatrics in the end, is because I was like, oh, I'm not safe to work in weight management, anything chronic disease, anything lifestyle related weight management. I didn't want a bar of, because it would mean I was be put in a morally questionable position, or I could be
Mm.
acting unethically because I knew that my behaviors around food were disordered.
Gotcha.
That in pediatrics I could avoid that because it's a totally different way of, I guess, in working clinically.
Gotcha.
I mean, I did love pediatrics as well.
Yeah.
Like that was a happy accident to find that. But yeah, I think that's how I guess I would, moral scrupulosity OCD would make me lose a lot of sleep, like become very, very anxious if I had thought that I had ever done something wrong or something to hurt anyone, even if it was accidental. Like that would be just absolutely crippling for me. And so I think it was a safer space for me to be for myself.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, so I actually had the lucky accident, or I guess coincidence, of I worked for a year and a bit down in Sydney at Sydney Children's Hospital, before returning back up. I live like in northern New South Wales, like Northern Rivers. At the time, I was living around Byron Bay. And I decided that I didn't want to work clinically anymore as much, so I wanted to do research because I really love research, and
Mm.
hence why I'm back doing a PhD. But I applied for a PhD at QT, got into one, and I was lucky enough to share an office with Fiona Willer. Now, I don't know if you know Fiona Willer, the non-diet approach, health at every size,
Yes,
absolute
I do. Yeah.
guru, really changed the dietetic landscape with
Yes.
her work around the non-diet approach. And so just sharing an office with her, like she introduced me to this whole concept, and I started to really see the way that I guess my eating disorder behaviors were playing into patriarchal values and misogyny and, all of the issues which I'd railed so hard against for most of my life that I was being now, I felt complicit through my behaviors unintentionally, like totally subconsciously. But that was an important kind of pivot point for me to start to think about my own self in the world differently and to take some action. So I started to do some reading and research and did lots of eating disorder trainings to try and like heal myself, I would say, I guess, or like
Yeah.
kind of. Um, but I was always left like feeling like it just still, I didn't have the magic answer. Like these trainings were developed for neurotypical presentations. And so I'd leave just being like, oh, there's just so much missing. I don't really understand. Yeah, so just slowly, slowly chipped away. And then I feel like I had to gain weight to have my babies, two babies. So I did that. I gained a bit of weight. And then with my firstborn, I developed postnatal OCD quite significantly, and that was really, really traumatizing. And I almost relapsed then, and I almost relapsed again with my second-born because he had a lot of food sensitivities that I had to eliminate lots of foods from my diet. And once again, just getting below a certain weight was enough to trigger all of the old thoughts and patterns in my mind. But yes, I would say I'd sat in quasi recovery for quite a few years. But certainly it was my noticing that my thinking pattern around feeding my children was still one of anxiety that actually made me realize I'm sitting in quasi recovery. Like I've been telling myself I'm good, but I'm actually still got some work to do. And they were the ones that kind of motivated me to do the last bit of work and yeah, push myself into recovery. But I think a really important part of that was understanding neurodivergence. And I was diagnosed ADHD 5 years ago, started to self identify autistic around the same time. And then last year got my autism identification formally. So, yeah, that's my story. That
Congratulations.
was very long.
No,
Sorry.
I think there's so many things in there that, because I mean, we were chatting in the last episode to Margot White about ARFID, and
Mm,
she was saying that you can't you can't be cured of ARFID because oftentimes it's a way that you eat to, then it's often stems from uh, a neurodivergent brain, and you can't cure neurodivergence, so you can't often cure the way people prefer to eat. So
yeah,
it's,
100%.
and I think listening to your story, it's very much, you can see how the neurodivergent weaves so much throughout that story, which is, I think, one of the reasons why I really wanted to hear your lived experience, because it's not a classic case, but it's, as I was saying, it
Mm,
makes total sense how all of this happened.
mm,
I've said it before, I don't ask myself why things happen, I ask myself why not. And
yeah, yeah.
it's like, of course this happened. And of course this story makes sense, because especially when you're in it, you're like, why is this happening to me? And like, you look above it, it's like, well, you were out of control. You had, things, you were just trying to work in a world that doesn't quite fit.
Yeah, and like I really feel like the eating disorder was functional in that it narrowed my focus.
Mm-hmm.
It narrowed in and like really honed me in to what I wanted to achieve at that time, which was cohesion with my family, and to feel like I belonged somewhere, but also to be able to get this study done and just to be contained. Like, yeah, like it was so adaptive in that way. It contained, my gender dysphoria. It contained, it actually, and the other big thing is like it completely cut off my sex drive. And so, I my family was religion is extremely homophobic. Homophobia was explicit in our household growing up, and I'm also a late blooming queer person because that in turn, like I never felt I would explicitly say to my parents, like, it's not okay to be homophobic, but I internalized a lot of that messaging around myself. And so, the eating disorder function to completely take away my sex drive. I felt like I was married to my ex-husband and he was, I have a lot of respect for him, and we were really good mates before we got married. And he's also neurodivergent, and like we've been through the ringer, but we're really good mates now on the other side of, our separation. And you know, I felt like I was asexual though for a good portion of that, but it still didn't make sense but yeah, so once I realized I was queer, I was like, oh, like the penny dropped. I was like, okay, oh, right, okay, got that. There's a lot of questions, but also like reflecting back on the eating disorder, it also made sense that that was another function
Yeah.
that it was serving.
Oh, eating disorders work. I mean, we've said this before, is eating disorders
Yeah.
are very effective. They have effective coping
Yeah.
mechanisms. They work. They are very good at what they do, which is to provide people comfort and escape, a sense of control, a way of, it provides them safety in a kind of unsafe way. But yeah, they absolutely,
absolutely.
they absolutely serve a purpose, and that's why they work, and that's why they're often so hard to
Yeah.
break, because there's so many other factors that are going on outside of that. So yeah.
So many other factors, and I'm going to take another sidetrack, but just going off you're going to be like, oh my gosh, Anna,
No,
stay on track a little bit.
all
But
good.
I was listening to the episode that you recorded with Margot, which was brilliant. I'm so like, Margot is just awesome. Love their content. And I was just reflecting on, what you just shared again around, if you're working with someone with ARFID, it's not like you're going to cure them of having ARFID-like tendencies or predisposition towards eating in that particular way or experiencing the relationship with food in that particular way. And I think that interestingly, one of the things I've reflected on, I don't hear talked about a lot, is like now in my recovery, my eating profile is more ARFID-like, I guess, but I'm aware of it and I manage it in that way. But when I was in my eating disorder, I was much more neurotypical in my eating. I ate 3 meals, I ate snacks, but I was rigid, and I was orthorexic in my thinking around it, and very moralizing, and do you know what I mean? Like it was all consuming, and now I don't even think about food at all. Like there's zero food noise in my brain, but I can have to be careful that I don't go the other way and it become like I just am so out of tune with my hunger and satiety. Yeah.
I think, yeah, it's especially when you kind of go into this eating disorder recovery space. And I mentioned this again with Margot, it's this 3 meals a day, 3 snacks in between. And one thing, especially with neurodivergence, is a lot of people do lose that connection with their intuitive eating or their hunger, the hunger cues, which is why intuitive eating, which is often hailed as like, oh, this is the way everyone should eat. Yes and no. It's not everyone. I think one size fits all for anything is bad. And so I think intuitive eating for neurodivergent folk is a completely different thing compared to intuitive eating for people who have natural hunger cues.
Oh, absolutely. I think if I relied on intuitive eating, especially once I've added ADHD medication into the mix, like that would be not an ideal scenario for me.
That's one thing I've been chatting at length with my psychiatrist about, because I spoke all about my previous history with an eating disorder, and she's like, she wanted, she's like, oh, we'll probably look into medication, but and she went through the whole thing about this is what they can do, and I think I'm pretty good these days of having, like, oftentimes just relying, if I'm not hungry, I still have to eat something because it's a non-negotiable. And being
exactly.
And being in
That's
those
part
habits.
of your recovery maintenance, right? Is like, and I think that becomes even more critical once ADHD medications are introduced, and I think that actually there needs to be a lot more support for clinicians in how to support people with that adaptation, I guess, because I don't think that having had a history of an eating disorder should be a grounds to refuse anyone ADHD medication.
Absolutely
Because
agree.
there are ways that we can support people, and we just need to be aware and careful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now I realize we've been talking for like nearly 40 minutes and we haven't actually defined what neurodivergence is. So why don't we do that? What is neurodivergence and what does it mean? We're finally here, guys.
I'm so sorry. That's like
No,
my little like tangent
no,
going to
I
front and
think,
center.
again, lived experience. That's what this podcast is. It's a lived experience podcast. We needed that. That's why I always start with that question. So,
Yeah. I love it.
and
I
I
love
think
it.
it's also, it gives an anecdotal version about what neurodivergence is without, before we actually get into this is what this is what the DSM says, or not the DSM, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
This is what here's the actual definition.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll do my best. Like maybe if we start with like neurodiversity is probably a nice place to start. So neurodiversity is simply a term that came out of the conversations that were being had by autistic advocates online back in the 90s. And it really is a term that simply refers to the diversity of human minds that is a naturally occurring and valuable, I guess, thing in our human species. And so neurodiversity is a biological fact. I think about it in the same way as like biodiversity, like the variation in species in our environment. Neurodiversity is simply the variation of different neurocognitive profiles or ways of thinking that is present in our population. But when we think about neurodiversity, so we've got all of this diversity here in our population, we have some people's profile that is they're more like the majority. So that would be what we call neurotypical. So this simply means a style of neurocognitive functioning that is most like the dominant style that's present in our population. So counter to that, to be neurodivergent means that your neurocognitive style, your way of functioning, the way that your brain and nervous system interacts, is that it is not the same as the dominant style in our population. So it means that there's, the mind functions in ways that diverge substantially or significantly from that dominant neurotype, or the definition of society's definition of what is, air quotes, normal or not.
Yeah.
And so when we think about neurodivergence, it's really quite a broad term. And we can say that neurodivergence is really just the state of being neurodivergent. So I would say I am neurodivergent because I am autistic and I am an ADHDer and I also have OCD. And I've heard you talk in your trauma episode before, CPTSD can be included as or can be considered a form of neurodivergence, not an innate form because it happens through life's events, but like you were not born with it, but it is can be considered a way of being neurodivergent. Um, we see like the words neurodivergent and neurotypical being used a lot. I think one of the things I think that is used incorrectly a lot is that someone might say, like, I am neurodiverse,
Yes,
but
I did that
because,
in my email to
yes,
you,
I
and
mean,
I'm
and you
so
know what?
glad you could.
You did.
And that's again why I'm so glad that we put this question in there, because the terms are used interchangeably all the time, and literally
All
until
the
last
time.
night and your email, I didn't know the difference. So I'm glad we're talking about it,
Yeah.
because yeah, some
Oh,
people
look,
just don't know.
100%. And I remember, so like in my family unit, my daughter was the first person that was identified as autistic when she was 4.5. And so it was around that time, she's now almost 12, which is wild. So I've been on this learning journey for quite a while. But sorry, not long after that, I think I was on, or maybe it was a little bit after that, like I was on TikTok and I must have put something up, and someone from the autistic community actually just gently pulled me aside in the comments in the private message and said, look, you're using that term incorrectly. This is how you would use it. And I was so grateful that it was such a gentle calling in, and, I didn't feel any shame around it. And so I think that that's my aim now, is that these terms are difficult. They sound similar, and the nuance between them can take some time to really wrap your head around. So I don't think there's any no need for any shame around it. Like, we're all learning.
Yeah,
Like, I'm still learning new terms all the time.
yeah,
But certainly I do see it misused a lot, that someone would say I am neurodiverse, and I think the way that I remember it is like, well, I'm not biodiverse because I'm a single unit.
yes,
I'm a
that's
single being.
a really great way to put it.
Um,
And you gave me a
but
great
I'm
link as well, which I'll put in the show notes as well,
Yeah,
about that if you want to learn more about the difference between neurodiversity and the terms neurodivergent and neurotypical, there is a great link that Anna sent me. So I will put that in the link in the script,
Yeah.
description below.
Yeah, and that's one that's often referred to in academic sources as well. So Nick Walker, she's a autistic trans advocate, coined the term neuroqueering as well, which is like the simultaneous subverting of heteronormativity and neuronormativity. And I think that neuronormativity is probably another word that's helpful to define because I think when we're talking about eating disorders and neurodivergence, this is a concept that's super important and very relevant to the experience. So, neuronormativity is this upholding or privileging of neurotypical norms or ideals or values or ways of being in the world. So, I think a really simple example is if, say, at school, um, teachers might say to kids, like, you haven't made eye contact. So, this is to be respectful and for me to know that you're listening and paying attention, I need you to make eye contact. And so that's a neuronormative ideal because for neurodivergent people, and particularly those who identify as autistic, making eye contact does not feel helpful to communication and is actually can be a very negative or uncomfortable experience that can take away from the effectiveness of communication. So that's a really simple example of where neuronormativity, like these expectations we have and privileging of what is neurotypical behaviors above those which are neurodivergent. And if we think about eating, we can think about how this in all of the messaging in eating disorder treatment, in all of the public health messaging around eating and nutrition, we have this real privileging of neurotypical ways of engaging with food and eating, the structuring meal times, coming to sit together at the table, everyone eating together, everyone eating the same meal, eating regularly, being able to eat intuitively, which you already mentioned. All of these are neurotypical ideals, which when enacted upon neurodivergent people as they can be like a form of oppression, right? Because it's like, this is the ideal and you're not meeting this and you need to work harder to meet this ideal without actually understanding that this is not the ideal for this population of people. Anyway, there's another side tangent for you.
No, you nailed
The,
it. Like that exactly explains all of those terms. And I
yeah.
think you've also sort of dovetailed quite nicely into my next question, which is in terms of eating disorders, what makes neurodivergent folk more at risk of developing them? And I know that we sort of touched on that, especially when you were discussing your lived experience, but I'd love to unpack that a little bit more. So what makes people,
Yeah.
neurodivergent folk, more at risk of developing an eating disorder?
Yeah, and before that's such a great question. But before I answer, I did want maybe if it will be helpful if I just also add in that, when we talk about neurodivergence or so neurodivergence basically, we are not just talking about autism and we're not just talking about ADHD.
Yeah,
It is,
yeah.
as I described before, it's anything that's not like aligned with the majority neurotype in the population. And so we might see presentations such as DID or say PTSD or OCD or dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. All of those they are forms of neurodivergence. Whether or not someone who identifies with those labels actually also identifies as neurodivergent is a personal choice. So we can't
Is
assume. We just need to ask the individual.
yes.
Um,
Is Tourette syndrome also
and
classified in?
Tourette's as
Yeah,
well. Yes, absolutely. Yes, exactly. And I think that when we think about like that huge diversity of neurodivergence, when we think about the increased rates of eating disorder presentations, particularly we have good evidence around autism, we have good evidence around ADHD, some evidence building around Tourette's, especially around eating differences, not necessarily eating disorders, but differences, and OCD. Like we've got a lot of, I guess, evidence about increased prevalence of eating differences and eating disorders in these neurotypes. And so, what actually makes what's causing this increased prevalence? And I think it's multidimensional. There's a range of different things that are happening. For many people, there's sensory processing differences. And if you think about food is a very sensory experience, meal times, eating socially is a very sensory experience. And if your sensory processing works in a way that finds, I guess, normative ways of eating overwhelming, then it makes sense that eating is going to become a contested ground for you. Um, so we've got sensory processing differences, there's cognitive processing differences. So I guess ways of thinking, ways of, yeah, I guess like routine, like preference for sameness or preference for routine can be really important parts of a way that someone regulates their interactions with the environment. And so that can definitely play a role in it. Another element of cognitive processing is that a lot of autistic and ADHDers have a way of allocating their attention and interest, which is called monotropism. And so, have you heard of this term before?
I have not,
Yeah,
no.
so oh no,
No, I haven't.
oh you haven't. So, oh, this is really fascinating. You're going to love this one.
Okay.
So, so monotropism is an autistic developed like from the community theory of autism. It has now been also looked at in relevance to ADHD and found to be elevated amongst ADHDs as well. And basically what it is that it describes a style of allocating attentional information processing that is more likely to have like fewer, like say maybe one, two, or three special interests or narrow focuses of your attention, and you you really get an enhanced sense of regulation or hyper focus or engagement by focusing in and engaging with these focus points of attention. It's very difficult to pull yourself away from these focus points of attention because they are so highly engaging and regulating, and they do a really good job of making us feel like we fit within our environment without so much difficulty or tension. And so a monotropic mind, very eloquently describes the phenomenon or what is often called autistic special interests or spins, where we have, or which is in pathologizing terms is like narrow focus or, rigid interests, but really, if we look at it from an affirming point of view, these are very adaptive, self-regulating points of interest that a person holds. So an autistic mind, an ADHD mind is more monotropic, whereas a neurotypical mind we would describe as polytropic. So able to engage in a range of different interests, but the interest level is less and the focus is less. So the depth of engagement in it is less, and so it's easier to jump in between these different interests. So you're not having this like constant rupture as you're pulled between tasks. So one of the things, like, I think one of the ones that always pops out for me is like when I'm engaged in a monotropic interest. So, say if I'm working from home and I'm doing my research and I'm really like in this state of absolute flow, it's very aligned with hyperfocus and flow states. And then my kids come and they interrupt me. Mom, I'm thirsty. Mom, so and so did this. Mom, you know what I mean? Come and help me with this. And I have to really be very conscious not to react out of irritation and actual distress sometimes because I'm so, like, I'm inherently being rewarded by my nervous system by engaging in this monotropic interest, and constantly being ripped out of it is extremely frustrating,
Yeah.
and it's destabilizing, it's dysregulating, sorry. And so that might be for any parent out there, that might be a nice way to kind of capture that experience, is just being constantly ripped out of something that's really, really lovely and engaging and rewarding,
I feel
and
like I now owe
having
my
to.
husband a big apology for why I get really irritated when he interrupts me when I'm doing things. Because I'm like, in my head, I'm just like,
Yes.
no, I'm finally in flow. I'm finally focused on doing something. Why do you need to why do you need to talk to me right now? Like, what are you doing? Like, I'm finally in the zone.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. Yes, and I think what's really interesting about monotropism is that we can think about it in a way in relation to eating disorders,
Mm.
because if we have, so for me certainly food and nutrition became a special interest. I read food blogs like ad nauseum. I have all of them, major cookbooks. I would read these cookbooks as I put myself to sleep at night. I thought about food nonstop. It was a highly regulating and engaging activity for me to focus on, and hence the becoming a dietitian and becoming so rigid about my study around it that I ended up like doing so well in my exams. And do you know what I mean? It was just such a monotropic focus,
Yeah.
but it actually aligned with an eating disorder, which is unfortunate. Um, but if we're constantly ripping kids out of their monotropic interest without then supporting regulation or facilitating some way for them to re-engage in that interest, we can actually be creating like these little trauma points for them, which is going to make it, I guess can increase a range of difficulties that the children are experiencing, more meltdowns, more burnout, like etc. But like whatever we can do to support healthy engagement in monotropic interests can be really helpful. And I think as well, when I talked about Fiona Willer's introduction to me around a different way of actually engaging in my special interests that was more aligned with health and well-being outcomes that I was chasing as well, like that was a turning point because it allowed me to still maintain a monotropic interest in my field, but it changed the narrative and the actual intricacies of that interest. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
To be more aligned with recovery.
totally.
Yeah. Anyway, so there's other things. Trauma. Trauma is a massive one, and I think that I know you've done an episode on trauma with Callie. I think is that right? Um,
Yeah.
and and so that was really interesting. And what we know is that when we look at the experience of trauma for autistic children, is that autistic children are actually experiencing traumatic events that are not the same triggers as experienced or reported by neurotypical children. And so we've got things like, denial of autonomy. We've got things like sensory, I guess, overwhelm or entrapment. So if you think about mealtime experiences where the child is not allowed to get away from the meal, this overwhelmingly disgusting sensory experience, and they're being forced to be exposed to it without an ability to down-regulate that sensory stimulation that they're experiencing, that can be registered as a trauma. There's trauma around communication and not being able to articulate needs. So we've got a whole other range of trauma triggers that can then play into eating disorders, I feel like. Um, Higher rates of masking or camouflaging, which is where neurodivergent people subconsciously or consciously engage in social morphing. So trying to camouflage in so that they appear less neurodivergent, less autistic, less ADHD, so that they are more accepted and they experience less discrimination and oppression. But unfortunately, whilst I do see that for myself, that being able to consciously choose to camouflage is a privilege in some ways. I have to be careful because it can contribute to burnout and meltdowns and poorer mental health outcomes. There's been some good research around that. So, and then executive functioning.
Yeah. The big one.
Executive functioning, like massive. Like we could talk about like probably 3 episodes about that
Yes,
in
probably.
relation to eating and feeding. But I think what the main thing is like when we put these experiences together and when we put interweave it with differences in social relational communication, the way that we operate in that realm or that domain, we just have so many trigger points. So and then operating in a society which has this neuronormative way of, I guess, ideals around eating and feeding and simply being in the world, we're expected to be something different than what we naturally are. Like it's just, there's so many points at which an eating disorder can commence and can be, and then so many maintaining factors as well.
Yeah. Uh, Again, it's no wonder that there is such a high prevalence of eating disorders among neurodivergent folk because there are and just like there are so many factors that can contribute to developing an eating disorder, I think there are so many factors within neurodivergent folk that could cause an eating disorder. And we're not saying that every person who's neurodivergent will develop an eating disorder. We're not saying that. It's more if you are neurodivergent or your child is neurodivergent, it's being aware and being aware that you are higher risk because of, and like, how do you navigate that harm reduction and ensuring you're fostering healthy ways to manage neurodivergence and food and the way that you perceive your body.
100%. And I'm so glad that you mentioned, that important fact that not everyone who's neurodivergent is going to have an eating disorder or even like any kind of issues around eating at all. And I think that that's something that maybe stopped me from thinking that I was autistic for a bit is like, actually, I really eat a lot of different foods and I like food, like I enjoy different flavors and all of this kind of stuff. So there's a whole range of different experiences that are relating to food and relating to body experiences as well. Um, but harm reduction is super important, I think, in this space, and to that effect, understanding that it's not just about the food, right? It's not just something that's related to food or to a body that's necessarily going to be a trigger for someone to then engage in eating disorder or disordered eating behaviors. There's so many other factors that are much broader than that. Interpersonal victimization rates are super high amongst autistic people, like extremely high. Rates of experiencing sexual assault is extremely high, and we know that even in the general population, these experiences are going to increase the risk of someone developing an eating disorder. And so the fact is that neurodivergent people are more likely to have these challenging or difficult experiences in life generally. Plus, they've got these other factors that may actually support the development or the maintenance of disordered eating. And so harm reduction or harm minimization is super important in this space.
Yeah. And I also think that it's not done enough, especially in eating disorder treatment. So that brings me very seamlessly. I can see, I don't know if you saw what I did there, talking about how is current treatment failing neurodivergent folk apart from many ways.
Yeah, and I think that this again, like it's a big question because, and I will be quite clear, like I have never been engaged in eating disorder treatment, and knowing what I know now about treatments, particularly treatments before we had this awareness around autism and eating disorders, like I'm actually feel grateful in a way that I didn't have that engagement with the system.
Yeah, I didn't want to say
Um,
it because might have sounded, you know, uh, I don't know. It might have come across wrong, but I'm not surprised that you feel that way because again, we've spoken to many people who've said it actually caused me a lot of harm in treatment. Same with people. Our episode with Kai Schweizer and Hayden Moon, especially for someone who's beyond the gender binary, it's not helpful there either. And I think, like, I feel just on that, and I don't mean to tangent.
I love a tangent.
I was someone who was actually quite receptive to eating disorder treatment, which I guess to your point earlier is that's why it made me somewhat question, do I actually have ADHD? Because there were parts of treatment that I did find helpful. But then at the same time, I'm also aware, and my treatment team also told me this, is that your insight into your illness is your greatest asset. So for me, because I felt like I understood or I wanted to learn why I was doing things, although there was one massive piece of the puzzle that was missing. But for me, there was a lot of factors that caused me to have an eating disorder. But I guess I took a lot of that of my own and just like trying to outsmart it, and I think I found the same way in school as well, which was I was able to figure out what helped me and my brain. And then it was able to, I don't know, just kind of almost hack the system. I like in school, I figured out the best way that my brain was able to retain information. So I would just do that, even if other people would suggest other things. I'm like, yeah, that doesn't work for me. So I'm just going to do things my way. And so I guess I was able to do that. But now,
yes.
Yes. So, but I also know that that's not the experience for everyone. And hearing again, Callie talking about her experience, how her neurodiversity was definitely, and that how treatment definitely failed her neurodiversity as well. So I think I just want to say for anyone listening, if I don't want you to not seek treatment because you're neurodivergent, because I
Mm.
don't think that is a good approach either. I think seeking out people with a lived experience with neurodivergency and seeking out people who are aware of how to treat people with neurodivergence is your best bet.
Yeah, and I agree 100% because I think that um, there were points in my journey that I definitely needed treatment. Do you
Yeah,
know what I mean? Like
totally.
I would have been better off for receiving any kind of treatment. But and I'm very aware of my privilege that I had in that the way that my brain worked around my eating disorder was like as soon as I knew that I was triggering suspicion in people, that the shame cycle, the moral OCD part of it would kick in and be like, okay, I just have to maintain that so I don't capture any more attention because I don't like being perceived in that way. And so like my brain would hack, you know, the way to stay out of eyesight or not warrant any attention, um, and in a way that like whilst I feel like it kept me chronically unwell for longer, I
Yeah,
guess,
yeah.
but it also meant I didn't have to engage in treatment that had a risk of potentially not being helpful for me. And I think that for me, maybe engaging in treatment, I would have definitely taken on this perfectionistic, good person mindset and just become perfect at that. Do you know what I mean? Which,
I know
um,
exactly what you mean.
yeah,
Oh, you mean
but
trying to be the perfect patient? That's
yeah, yes,
yeah, that
and I
was me as
think
well.
yes. But I think it would have led to further confusion around myself and my own being longer term.
Mm,
Um, because back in those days, so we're talking like 10 years ago or 20 years ago. This is not like in the last 5 years even. This is a long time ago.
yeah.
The awareness of that wasn't there, and the approaches were more rigid even than they are now.
Hmm.
So so yes, take listeners take that with a grain of salt. I'm not talking about the current system, even though it is imperfect and there are many issues in it. There are also many providers out there now that are very aware of the need to adapt care to suit the needs of neurodivergent folks and trans folks and gender non-conforming folks. So there are these people out there. We just don't have enough of them yet.
Yeah.
So I
I
think
mean,
that that's a privilege to be able to access those supports.
absolutely. And
But
yeah, like my treatment was over 10 years ago as well. So
yeah, yeah,
it's
very
definitely,
different, I feel like.
yeah, I can't talk to
And
what it's currently like, but yeah, I know that it's changing slowly.
yeah, changing. That's right, slowly. And but I think as well, I just want to own like another privilege that I had was that I was able to avoid going to treatment because I studied to be a dietitian and I was able to access professional development around all of the different ways to support a person with an eating disorder, which I then like integrated into my own like self-care almost. So that's a very strong point of difference to a lot of people that would, yeah, I guess explain why I didn't get access treatment
Yeah.
in the traditional sense of it. Um, but to go back to your original question, Ash, so before we get sidetracked again, is
We're on a
that,
journey,
you know,
guys. We're on a journey. Come with us. Hold on. Scream if you want to go faster.
is that when I first started I guess, working in this space. So I was working as a pediatric dietitian. I had private practice in Byron Bay, and most of the families that were coming to me were neurodivergent. And this is actually before I knew I was neurodivergent myself, and so it was quite funny. But I just started doing things a little bit differently. I'd done the SOS training, and I felt really uncomfortable with some of the styles of intervening. Like it felt very fake and false and pressured and neuronormative, and it made me feel uncomfortable. And I had experiences where I was a really shit clinician and tried to like put this on other families, and they're like, "Love, that's not going to work." I'm like, "Okay." In my place. But those experiences, whilst I regret that I wasn't the ideal clinician for those families, they really did teach me that I was missing a whole lot of information and ways of being, ways of working. And so I started to do things differently, and that's how I ended up actually coming back to do my PhDs because I was like, I actually need to go and actually get some evidence around what I'm doing. So because I felt like a naughty dietitian breaking all the rules with these families. But I was actually seeing a lot of, not necessarily that they were walking away without ARFID, because we've talked around that it's not going to be that way, but they were walking away with a much healthier family dynamic around food, feeding and eating, and awareness of like safety measures to take, and how to kind of to engage in harm reduction within the family unit. And so if I look though at like adult eating disorder treatment, I think my stance has also softened a little bit in recent years. Like when I first started on this journey, I was very much, so I would focus a lot of on the things that weren't right around, like say CBTE or FET or DBT, like all of the issues that do actually are experienced with these modalities for many neurodivergent folks. Like there's a lot of invalidation or feelings of just like not like encouraging masking, or it just invalidating actual real extreme experiences of distress and expecting you to just be able to sit through it and tolerate it. So all of those things are issues. But what I've seen now as I listen to more stories and I read more research and I really engage with the community more, is that I see that neurodivergent folks are so diverse within ourselves, and that there are going to be, say, elements of CBT that would work for someone and elements of DBT that will work for someone. So it's not that we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but what the key thing I think is missing is this real core understanding amongst clinicians and amongst eating disorder services around what is neurodivergence and what is the impact of neurodivergence on feeding and eating disorders, not just in our service here, but in the broader community. And how do we holistically adapt our care in a very responsive way to better serve this community, using the tools that we have, because some of these tools can be adapted and applied in an affirming way to be very helpful for people. Um, so I think that's where I've kind of landed now, is that I think that services, I see that there's a great want for this information. Like a lot of clinicians come to trainings that I run, and like they're really engaged, and they want to do better for their clients and for the people they're supporting. And there's just like this thirst for knowledge about how to adapt the care that they are already giving, how to think about things in new ways, how to make sense of some of the conundrums that they're experiencing in their clinical practice. And there's also like concern around how to do things safely, which I think is a great thing, how to avoid causing harm. And I think that if we think, so maybe to close out this answer to this question, so what can services do better is like better understanding of the way that neurodivergence shows up for people and the way it interacts with eating disorders, and do better at actually teasing the neurodivergence and the eating disorder behaviors apart, and supporting people in the way that they need to be supported. So being very responsive and person-centered, respecting autonomy. But at the same time, I think that we also need to be very aware of like, I guess, self-monitoring. Are we causing harm? In what ways are we causing harm? How are we measuring that? How are we intentionally trying to capture that and record it and to do better? Because I think that as a sector as a whole, psychology, maybe even more broadly, we aren't great at, and dietetics, we're not great at, I guess, engaging with the idea that our work is causing harm.
And innovating off the back of that.
And innovating, that's right. So that's like any kind of mistake that we make is an opportunity to learn how to not make that mistake again. But if we're too scared to ask the question, then we're missing out on a whole lot of really rich information for how to improve our services.
Yeah, I think and one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on board this episode was at the ANZ AED conference, you were a very vocal advocate on the debate section, which was all about how lack of innovation is hindering eating disorder research. That was the actual topic, but that's the basic gist of it.
Yeah, that was the basic gist. You did well.
And how not being open to innovation is really holding us back. And I think there is this dedication to like, I think, what's it called? A sunken loss fallacy, where you've put so much time.
Yeah, sunk cost.
Sunk cost, that's it.
Yeah.
You've put so much time and effort and research and money, oh my God, money, into setting up the ways that these systems work and how do we treat eating disorders. And we've put so much as like when we have sample sizes of, or in these studies of people who probably are neurotypical and they are within the gender binary. Well, actually, let's be honest, mostly women. It's only
Yeah, that's true.
only on people who meet the quote unquote diagnostic criteria for anorexia nervosa in particular. And it's like, okay, we've built our treatment models on this sample size. It's like, okay, now what about the 95% of the rest of everyone else who has an eating disorder? And I think because we have sunken so much of this money and time into this research, I completely understand why there's a hesitation to abandon it. And we're not saying to abandon it. I think we can pick and choose from certain parts, but there needs to be a commitment. Now that I think, again, I'm jumping all over the place, but at the conference, at the conference, there was this renewed commitment and this, everyone was singing from the same song sheet about, no, we absolutely want to innovate and we're realizing that, you know, things might not be perfect in the past. We need to have individualized care and we need to be more focused on, or we need to be more mindful of neurodivergent folk and of people outside of, and focusing on anti-fat bias and those kind of things. I love the attitude. Now let's do that. Do that stuff. Like actually
I agree.
Commit to changing things. Being, like what you said, being open-minded, asking questions, posing new questions. And I'm fully aware that, especially in the research space, in order to get research funded, it does need to have, you know, it has to tick, you know, certain boxes and it needs to be in the greater, wider interest of society. And I'm like, it does that. But yeah, it's just, I'm fully aware that I'm not a researcher and it's like, oh, it's a little bit more complicated than that, Ash. And I know, but I think even on a individual clinician basis, I do feel that especially now we're seeing a lot of clinicians take it upon themselves. It's like, okay, if the rest of the system isn't moving as fast as we need it to, I'm going to do something. And that's how you're seeing a lot of lived experience clinicians, people who are taking extra courses, listening to people with lived experience, adapting and, you know, doing the things for harm reduction to help their patients because they realize that the industry isn't keeping up. But we still want to make change and live to our values of providing the best care to people with eating disorders and their families.
Yeah. Oh, you've covered so much ground there, and I agree.
Sorry.
No, I love it. I love it, and I agree. You would have heard me just yeah, the whole way through. I'm probably interrupting your audio, but chirping away in the background here. But I think that, you know, you've really hit the nail on the head for so many different points here. Is that, you know, there has been a lot of, I guess, enthusiastic support for innovation and, like, I guess, vocalization around the need for it and the importance of it and how, like, we all want it, but actually the translation of it has been slower than is ideal. And as you said, yeah, it's complicated. There's funding issues, there's ethics issues, there's like a whole range of political issues in that, as to why. But also, I think what's really interesting is also shifting mindsets around how do we care for someone in an eating disorder? Like, what does that actually mean? Like, what is treatment versus what is care? And I think that, and I've stolen that idea from Andrea Lamar, who is like one of my research idols. It does a lot of really great feminist kind of critical eating disorder research. But and I think that this is the thing that's maybe missing in terms of this translation of, I guess, this lived experience account, all of this wisdom that we're hearing, you know, and how do we translate that into research or into treatment modalities is this, that people want to be cared for. And so care is different than experiencing a manualized treatment or delivering a manualized treatment. That isn't care, that's treatment.
Yeah.
And so how do we innovate in a way that actually aims for care and not just treatment of the list of symptoms that are in the DSM-5, because we all know that that leads to quasi-recovery.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely.
But also, like, we've got this, I guess, issues around and maybe more so in like places like the United States, where like there's real economic constraints there around insurance and who's paying for the eating disorder treatment, who can access care. And similar here in Australia, like we've got tensions around who can actually access the appropriate care. Like, because if you don't have private funding, you might not be able to source out a neurodiversity affirming clinician
Yeah.
if you don't have the funding to find that person privately, because not every public service is going to have someone on board that is across that way of working.
Yeah.
And so there's so many constraints in the system at the moment, but I really would like to see more innovation. And I think that one of the ways that we can, I guess, push push the traditionalists kicking and screaming into innovation is by looking at the harm that has been caused by traditional treatments
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
looking at it more openly and having these discussions with more humility. Because, I can put my hand up and say there's definitely times I've worked with clients where I've accidentally caused them harm. And like those experiences sit heavy on my shoulders and heavy on my heart, but they have been pivotal points in my learning as a clinician. And I know, just like, not that, I mean, I regret that they happened, but I don't regret that experience for myself because I feel like it taught me so much,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. I
Yeah.
don't mean that in any kind of dismissive way at all to
No,
that
I totally get
person's
what you're
experience.
saying. It's like it was a cause or it's a catalyst for change. And I
Yeah,
think,
yeah, that discomfort, that dissonance we feel
yeah,
around, oh, I tried to do good, but I did bad,
yeah. And
you know?
instead of just being like, oh, well, that's the patient's fault, which I think
Yeah,
so many
oh,
people
yeah.
do, I think it's looking at like, okay, I don't want to do that again. I don't want to feel that again, even if it's not a selfish thing, but like looking at like, okay, I don't feel great with what I've done. How can I prevent that from the future? And I know that, and what's more in line with my values, especially as a clinician. The system often, I think, needs to be burnt down and start again. And unfortunately, that's probably just not able to happen. So, okay, how can we look at, on a clinician or case by case basis, how can I live to my values? I say it's like I'm a clinician, I'm not. But how can I work to my values and provide the best care for that patient that is in line with what I believe, kind of thing?
Yes, yes. And I think that I really love that. And I think that this, I guess, value-led approach to working with and supporting people and their kin and carers, their families, is critical. And with that, so yes, we can work in line with our values and we can reflect on the ethics of what we're doing and the professionalism of what we're doing, but also like, can we be really humble and
Yes.
like humble in all of the ways, humbles in the ways that we don't know about experiences that people have, or we might not have the language or the shared meaning to make sense of people's experiences, and humble in that we understand that a lot of people's testimony has been invalidated and denied for so long that they are no longer confident to share their testimony with us. And do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
there's so many elements of what we need to do in order to create safety and to really authentically support people with care that are experiencing, some of the most challenging moments of their life as with an eating disorder. Um, so yeah. Anyway, I feel
Yeah.
like I've just rambled off on a tangent, but I think you've really touched on something that's very, very important and that I value a lot in the research that I do and the work that I do. The advocacy work is really helping people to, I guess, step outside the status quo to allow them to be able to access that humble part of themselves that says, actually, I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know what is the right thing to do to help this person right now. I don't know how to help this person. I need to ask. I need to
Yeah, and
I need to
honestly,
find out.
that's okay.
Yeah.
I think curiosity is a really good thing, and I don't think we should ever lose that. But there's also no harm in saying, I actually don't know. And by me trying to do that work actually might cause harm. So I'm going to go and find someone who's better for you for that. And
Yeah.
then we can come back and loop around. And if you want, go away later and be like, okay, I couldn't do that thing for that person right now, but I'm going to make sure for the next person I can do that. And then taking the active steps in order to, you know, educate yourself. And I think that's a really good thing. And I think there are too many people who are afraid to do that. And
Mm.
I think that there should be more of that. And I know that we've talked a lot about how we've kind of wrapped these two questions into one, which was how can the system change in order to help neurodivergent folk? And I think we've done that. But we've also spoken a lot about clinicians. What I think I'd like to touch on before I bring us in for a landing is to how can patients themselves or parents of neurodivergent children who are experiencing eating disorders, how can they advocate for themselves in order to, I think, yes, clinicians doing half the work is a good idea. Also, how can patients advocate for themselves to meet their clinicians where they are as well?
Yeah, great question. And I think that, I'm always wary of putting more responsibility on people to advocate for themselves, but I
Absolutely.
actually think it's also very important. So thank you for asking. Um, um, I think like doing as much learning as possible around and reflecting on how being neurodivergent shows up for you and impacts you in your own individual experience of an eating disorder or your child's individual experience of an eating disorder or feeding difference is really important. And then connecting in with like the neurodivergent community so that you begin to benefit from shared wisdom and gain confidence in that will then be able to support you to go forward and advocate more firmly for what is actually needed, because I think it can feel quite isolating or scary if you are a parent and you feel like this lone island, like beating on the door saying no, 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 my kid needs this, my kid needs this, my kid needs this, and they're just getting pushback from clinicians because they don't understand that experience. That if you have a community behind you of affirming parents or people that are on the same learning journey, that can be really helpful. But there's some, I guess, freely available tools and resources that are available now that I think can be helpful for people that are going down this path of advocating. So when I was with Eating Disorders Neurodiversity Australia, some of the members of that team were really great, and they actually took the report that Laurence and I co-authored, which was an absolute tome. Like it was a massive, like 188-page report or something like that. Really academic language, but they took the key points in that and they made it into freely downloadable resource sheets that you can take. And there's some for parents, there's some for doctors, there's some for other clinicians, dietitians, and so you can go and access those on that website. I'll give it to you. You can put it in the show notes.
Links in the
Um,
description below.
yeah, exactly. But they can be like really simple resources to take and share. There's also like one of the papers I often go back to, which I believe is open access, so it should be freely downloadable, is a paper that was a Delphi study, which basically takes panels of experts and asks them to kind of reach consensus on a range of different statements. And part of the expert panel was actually autistic people that had lived experience of being an inpatient for a restrictive eating disorder. And they were talking about the ways in which they wanted treatment to be better and to be more affirming, to support recovery. And it's just a really beautiful paper because it gives a list, like bullet point lists of the things that services and clinicians should be doing to better support the needs of autistic people experiencing restrictive eating disorder. So you can take a paper like that in. And also if you are a parent and you're a pediatric child, and especially if you're going in to be an inpatient, which can be a really, really difficult experience because we know that the sensory environment, the meals that are provided, that is not generally affirming. And there's a lot of rigidity in terms of what's offered and the rules and all of that. That can be very difficult. But there's a group from the NHS over in the UK that they actually produced like an emergency refeeding guideline for pediatric patients presenting for refeeding with a restrictive sensory-based feeding or eating difference or disorder to their inpatient services. And it is brilliant. It is like honestly one of the best documents I've seen because it basically lays out all of the accommodations that should be being made for neurodivergent children or adolescents that are presenting to inpatient care. And it sort of talks around the adaptations that should be made to menu offerings, the ways that that there should be proactive management of, nasogastric tube insertion to reduce trauma. Just so many different, like, really good points there. So there are some resources available. They're not super easy to find, so maybe we'll put them in the show
Yes, I'll
notes.
put the Delphi study and the NHS refeeding
Yeah, that document.
emergency
I still have to
document.
go and like find it all the time. Like, where did they put it? But it's really useful. So I think that there's tools like that. But yeah, I just wanted, like, I guess, acknowledge, like, the exhausting nature of having to constantly advocate for something that really should be a part of, someone's general care as a human being that should be afforded dignity and respect. So
Yeah, hard
just
agree.
to acknowledge that's exhausting. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, it definitely shouldn't be on the person's shoulders who has neurodivergence to have to constantly advocate for themselves. Clinicians do have to do some of the work. And I think there's no perfect answer. I think there needs to be a lot of systemic shift. I think in the absence of that, work on both sides needs to happen.
Absolutely.
And yes,
Yeah.
that's unfair. Just point blank, it's unfair.
Yeah.
I want to acknowledge that. It's like, it's not okay. And I think there needs,
Yeah. And I think as well, one other resource that might be really helpful, and this is maybe helpful for clinicians that are trying to advocate within their service for a more supportive, affirming environment or way of operating, is there's something called the Autistic Space Framework that was designed by some autistic researchers and advocates. That basically is some really low cost, easy to implement ways in which services can create a service and space that's more affirming and supportive of autistic and otherwise neurodivergent folks' needs to support engagement with healthcare, basically, because there's some issues around. Really having higher healthcare needs, but also having much more difficult experiences engaging in neuronormative healthcare services. So,
yeah.
yeah.
And I know that there might be some people listening to this thinking like, oh my God, that seems like so much work. It's like, yeah, now imagine what it's like to live in that and
Yeah.
how much work that these people are having to do on an everyday basis just to try and fit into the standards of a neurotypical
Yeah.
framework. So yeah, it's a lot of work,
Absolutely.
but the neurodivergent person is working harder. So be
Yeah,
mindful
exactly.
of that as well. It's not their fault.
So important. Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important. And I think that's why I like the autistic space one, is because they're actually very easy things to do.
Yeah.
Like, it's not, it takes, like, that's no longer an excuse when you read that article. It's like, actually, they're kind of simple.
And I think also operating in a neurodiverse way and having a neurodiverse friendly treatment benefits everybody because
Absolutely. Neurodiversity affirming care is for everybody because it
exactly.
basically respects everyone's individual neurocognitive
Yeah,
variation and ways of being in the world.
exactly.
So, it's actually going to be better for everyone.
Yes. It's not you have to do, things different for these three people and something completely different for someone else. No, it's holistic.
Yeah, but you know what? It will take this kind of, I guess, change of mindset from being like, well, these are the rules. These are the rules that we have in this service, and everyone has to come and eat together, and we're not allowed to have any distractions at the meal table, and they're not allowed to jiggle their knee or eat with a teaspoon or whatever. Like, all of these things, which could actually be authentic neurodivergent needs around feeding and eating, like having this rigid, which is quite ironic, right, when we think about eating disorders.
I know,
But this
right?
rigid approach to eating disorder treatment is no longer appropriate when we're working in a neurodiversity affirming model. And so that is the big change. And so that would then remove this barrier. Well, they're getting special treatment. It's like, well, actually, no, everyone gets special treatment because that is what care is.
And also, I think if someone is exhibiting behavior like jiggling their leg, like I've been doing for this entire recording, asking that person, where is this coming from? Unpacking it with them, figuring out, is it an anxiety response from the food? In which case, how can we manage that anxiety by doing something else and not saying, stop doing that because, that's wrong. It's like, well, clearly that's assisting someone by doing something. it's serving a purpose. Let's figure out what that purpose is. Can we sub it for something else? Or if it's just like, I don't even know I'm doing it. It's just, it's comforting for me. Okay.
Yeah.
That's like asking that person and believing them is great.
Mm-hmm. Oh, 100%. And also like making space for that person not to know.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of us, and especially if we haven't been identified as neurodivergent, or, we don't have any conceptualization of what that is or what it could mean or what that experience would have in relevance to us. Like, we as clinicians need to be able to support people to unpack that. And that takes time and patience and a little bit of exploration with the person. And so certainly, like, for me over my journey, I'm like, oh, that's because, of the autism
Yeah.
or the tism, or, that's some ADHD of me. I just like, I realize that now. But we have to kind of support people on this learning journey as they can begin to tease apart, like, what actually is the eating disorder and what is the, autistic experience. So for the longest time, because I learned in uni that eating like with a teaspoon was an eating disorder behavior. So I immediately just was like, oh, well, that's right. Like, I always eat with a teaspoon. That's a bad thing. I must change this thing about me, in order to be recovered. And like, now that I understand my neurodivergence and I can look back with that lens throughout my whole like life and the way that I've eaten. I can see all these, ways that I've engaged with food that are very autistic, which would also be misrepresented as being eating disorder behaviors, but actually are not, because they come from a totally different place in my existence and my way of thinking and being. So like, eating with a teaspoon for me is a much more pleasant experience because I've got less metal in my mouth and it's not going to bang against my teeth. And I have this really weird thing around, like, I don't like food touching my lips. And so like, I'm really self-conscious about the way I eat in front of people because I feel like I'm trying to always avoid the food getting on my lips. Then think I look like I eat weird. So a teaspoon takes care of this issue for me.
Yeah.
but I believed that it was an eating disorder behavior, but now I can look back and I'd be like, actually, no, it's, like, didn't come from that originally. Did I need to learn flexibility around it? Yes, I did.
Yeah.
But, you know,
I still eat my like breakfast cereal with a teaspoon. I don't know why. I just like it. I prefer it. I honestly, it just feels better.
that's right.
And
That's
that's
exactly
fine.
right. It just feels better. Like, make it make sense. I can't make it make sense
No,
any
I
more than
can't
that.
explain it. One last resource that I found helpful in the last couple of weeks, which I mean, there are certain parts of it that. Sorry, I should probably say what it is first. It's my psychiatrist recommended to me the book "The Year I Met My Brain" by Matilda Bosley, and
I haven't read it, but I've heard it's good.
it is very good. And also big shout out to my psychiatrist because I mentioned that, I can't really just sit down and read because I find it really distracting. I get really distracted. So I mainly listen to things like podcasts or audiobooks. So when she recommended the book to me, she said, oh, you can go and listen to that. I'm like, oh, that's what we're talking about, guys. Neuroaffirming care, but just that it wasn't even,
Easy.
you can go read that. No, it was the language. And I noticed because I was
Yeah.
like, oh, you said go listen to that. I'm like, snaps, love her already.
So good.
Yes. So it's available if you have Spotify Premium. It's available in the audiobook section. So highly recommend. Yeah, I'll have the link in the show notes below. But that book has been really, really good. Just in terms of just like, it's about someone who was diagnosed with ADHD later in life or around like 24 years old. And she just talks about why the brain does what it does. She has a really great sort of allegory on trying to explain what executive functioning is and why people get overwhelmed. And then also has a few little hacks and tips on how to manage ADHD and things like that. And I've been finding, I'm nearly finished, but I found that book really, really helpful. So again, I'll link that one below because I feel for me, I've always been like, I need to understand everything about why I am the way I am in order to be like, okay, now then I can work my way around this. I need to know what I'm dealing with in order to figure out how I'm going to not fix it, but how I'm going to manage it. So
How are you going to like support yourself in the way that you want to be supported, right?
Exactly.
It's not that you necessarily want to not be ADHD anymore. It's just like, I just have to deal with the reality that is, and I want to exist in this world.
How can I make it
Because
easier for myself?
yeah, 100%. 100%. And I think I think I like what you've shared around like just finding other people's stories or other people's descriptions of their experience can be so helpful for us, like restructuring our own understanding of ourselves and like arriving at these new insights and these new understandings. Like I think you can, listen to your audiobooks, like on TikTok, like yes, there's misinformation there for sure, but there's also a lot of really good information, and there's lots of people sharing lived experience. You've got podcasts like yours. There's the Eating Disorders Neurodiversity Australia podcast, but there's the Neurodivergent Woman podcast. There's so many different podcasts out there now where we can hear and learn from each other in community, that I think that that's such a valuable part of the journey of understanding whether or not you're still in an eating disorder or whether or not you're past it, and still trying to make sense of that experience, or if you're a clinician simply wanting to understand how to better support neurodivergent clients or patients. Like these are, it's almost essential. If you want to be affirming, you have to understand the lived experience.
Yeah, 100%. Now, I know that we could probably talk for another hour.
I know we've gone over, way over.
No, there's no such thing as too long. Actually, there probably is.
You can cut chunks out.
No, I don't want to. That's the thing. I mean, the only person I'm feeling sorry for is myself in the edit. Because people can
Yeah,
pause
I'm feeling
this
sorry for you already. Like,
people can pause and come back and things like that and fast forward. Put us on double speed, honestly. Actually, that might be really scary because we already talk really fast.
I know. I listen to every podcast, so on 1.5 speed at least.
Yeah. So we always start the episodes with people sharing their lived experience, because I like to get a nice sort of laying the groundwork of what an eating disorder looks like and how it's different for everybody. And that's why we always tend to end the questions as well with what recovery, being recovered, quote unquote, what that means to you, or recovery maintenance, whatever it is. Because I think there's different ways to have an eating disorder. There's different ways to be recovered. So what does recovery and being recovered mean to you?
Yeah, like I think recovery is such a contested word in this space, but so I just will caveat this with like this is my own interpretation of it. It doesn't have to represent anyone else's, as you've said,
Yeah.
And I think I was in quasi recovery, as I mentioned earlier, for such a long time, like many, many years, where I still had a lot of food noise in my brain, and I guess rigidity or anxiety around food. And so for me, being now I consider myself to be in recovery in my own version, my neurodivergent version of recovery, I'd like to think of it as, where actually I don't have any food noise anymore. And I clearly remember the first day that I realized that it had disappeared, and just what a moment that was of relief and gratitude, and also like just like it kind of hit home how noisy it had been for so long.
Yeah.
Without it, just had become so normal, to then not have it and to notice that it was gone was really beautiful. And so I think that for me it's having a what I call like quite a benign relationship with my body now. Like I I see it as functional. I am aware that I have straight size privilege. I have a lot of other privileges in my life, and so I I just have this, I guess, appreciation for my body that is not like too extreme, and it's kind of a bit benign. It's a bit boring. I don't know if that's the right word for it. Um, so I think that that's a sign that's good for me. Like if I gain weight, not that I ever weigh myself, I can tell by the way my clothes fit, then I just think, oh, okay. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't tend to labor on it too much in my mind, so that's a really good sign for me, about it. That's the food noise and the way that I experience my body. Um, but also, like, I guess my relationship with food is, like I said before, like when I was in my eating disorder, it was very heavily orthorexic in its orientation, very restrictive. And so now I just eat what I want to eat, and um, I don't have any food rules anymore. I just I eat, all different foods at any time. I don't just have let go of all of those rules around it. But what I found is that, like, I actually have fallen into a rhythm of eating that was quite similar to what I had as a child and teenager, where I before pre-eating disorder. So it's very similar to what that was, which I feel like was my natural state. Not that invested in eating. Like, as a dietitian, I feel like that's a little bit like unusual. Like, I don't actually care that much.
I think that's a
Like, I love it when someone cooks me a beautiful meal. I love going out to eat a beautiful meal, but I just actually don't care that much anymore. I don't find it that interesting anymore. Which is funny. But I'm also conscious that to stay in this space, I do have to take steps to maintain my recovery. And so so one of the things I like to do is I like to go raving. So I still never lost my love of techno music that I had in my early 20s and late teens. And so, but like, that's a very taxing energy. I burn a lot of energy
mm,
doing that when I dance for 8 hours overnight. So if I do that, I am really conscious that on the way home, I am going to refuel my body
hmm
with foods that I know are appropriate for refueling that don't necessarily meet the healthy eating guidelines.
yeah.
But like, that's my priority in that moment, is like, oh no, I have just, I know that I've burned a lot of energy and I need to refuel my body immediately, ASAP. It doesn't matter what it is. Like, I just need to get it in. And then the next day I will refuel as well. Do you know what I mean? So I'll
Yeah.
feel those hunger cues and I will respond to them appropriately without any restriction.
Yeah.
But the other thing I'm aware of in my recovery is that I can sometimes forget to eat, and my ADHD meds do suppress my appetite a little bit, so I tend to mechanically eat through the day.
Mm,
I don't feel like eating, but I force myself to mechanically eat. I don't enjoy it, but it's just something that I have to do to get to stay where I want to be.
yeah.
So I do that,
And also to
but
prevent like any relapses in future, right?
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I just like, oh no, I just must, this is just part of what I have to do.
Yeah.
I have to eat to the clock. I don't eat to my intuition on the, like, intuitive eating, like my body cues on those days. But then some days, for whatever reason, hyperfocus, life, my really bad executive functioning, like it's my biggest struggle in life is time processing and executive functioning. I will find myself unable to eat lunch, like if I've not packed it, or I then have to rush to get my kids, and it's like before I know it's 4 p.m. and I haven't eaten. And I'm very aware that that feeling that I get in my body, like of an empty stomach, if I let that happen, like, say, a couple of times in a row, like, that is a danger point for me, because I'm like, ooh, that feeling has an old familiar kind of positive association with it, that that I that even though I'm very much in recovery and I don't want to engage with it, it's interesting to kind of sit there outside of that experience and be like, oh, that feeling's creating this thought in my brain that's
Yeah.
like, that's tempting to, oh, let's just
That
push that a
old
little
neuro
bit.
pathway is tingling a little.
Yeah, like, let's push the envelope on that one. Let's see how, do you know what I mean? And I'm like, oh no, like, I'm not going to do that. It's like this little, like, in my brain, little conversation happening.
Yeah, it's
The
like
two parts of me.
yeah,
Um,
it's like oh, someone's walked down that path, and it's like oh, there's someone there. Oh, what's going on?
yes. So for me, it's like immediately I have to engage in the opposite corrective action. So if I feel that in my body, if I notice that sensation and I notice myself have that response to that situation of it feeling tempting to engage in it further, I immediately go, I stop whatever I'm doing, I immediately go and I do the opposite corrective action, which is to fuel myself
Yeah.
with whatever I can get my hands on, basically. But just having, it's just like having that awareness now around my triggers, around the steps that I can take to maintain, the steps I need to take when I'm accidentally triggered. All of those parts are part of those activities, actions are part of my recovery maintenance program. And for me as well, so I don't think I mentioned, but like, after I kind of was recovered from my eating disorder, it just kind of translated into some self-harm. And I think that this is another thing that we haven't touched on, but we'll just touch on real quickly, is that you can be recovered from the eating behaviors,
hmm
but that doesn't mean that you have psychological recovery, right? We all know
mm,
this. And so for me, my eating behaviors had recovered, but psychologically, I had just translated that into a different form of self-harm. I'm very firm on the idea that eating disorders are a form of self-harm for
hmm
many people.
hmm
And so for me, like, keeping myself in recovery is avoiding the situations that trigger me wanting to self-harm. And so for that, for me, I've had abusive relationships and abusive dynamics, interpersonal victimization. So I very much have had to do a lot of work in learning how to keep myself safe in dynamics so that I don't have meltdowns that lead to self-harm that then lead to who knows what else. Like I feel like it's like a pathway for me that I really am proactive in avoiding. So yeah, there's a lot of different things, but for me, working with a neurodiversity affirming therapist around everything else except for my eating, like around my moral OCD, has been pivotal. Around my CPTSD, around understanding my neurodivergence. These are the things that ultimately have really helped solidify my recovery, without a doubt.
And this is why we ask that question, because it's honestly, it is my favorite question to ask, because
Such a great question.
because
Yeah.
I think we fundamentally reject that there's one way to be recovered, there's one form of recovery, and what it looks a certain way. I fully reject that idea. So I think what I almost wish that this podcast will be, what I hope it is like a nice anthology or collection of stories that people can, they don't have to relate to every single person. They may relate to one more than another, but hopefully there's enough here to affirm people that their version of recovery and being recovered or whatever it is right because it's yours. And that to me is the most important thing. And I think, yeah, some people will recover from an eating disorder, never have another thought again, be on their merry way, never relapse. Good for them. Congratulations. A lot of people, they may be living in a constant state of recovery maintenance where they engage in constant harm reduction and they have a much better quality of life, even if there may be some eating disorder tendency still there. Again, congratulations. You've done a lot of hard work, and that does not invalidate that person's recovery over another. And I'm a big advocate for making eating disorder recovery as diverse as those who live with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I really love what you said around, it's for an individual to decide what outcomes they use to gauge their own progress and their own recovery. And I think that this is something that is actually hindering innovation. If we circle back to that, is like in the field, is that we have these really rigid ideas around, well, what is progress in eating disorder recovery? And I would say that's actually missing the mark significantly for many people, and particularly neurodivergent folks, when we use these one size fits all outcome measures to track progress. So yeah, you're right. Like everyone needs to make sense of their own experience, and everyone should have that right, and have their testimony and their meaning making valued and respected.
Yeah, 100%. For the people who've made it to the end, congratulations. You deserve a prize, a cuddle, um, something.
So much cheering.
So much cheering. Thank you for staying with us. Again, it felt like the last nearly 2 hours have flown by because I feel this has been such an incredible conversation. And I'm very, very thankful for not only you trusting us to share your story with us, but also being so open and so knowledgeable and just sharing that wealth of experience that you have with us and everyone listening. So thank you so much. If people want
My
to
pleasure.
find more of you, your work, your thoughts, all of the above, where can people find you? Now is the place to plug everything you want, and everything will be in the show notes.
I am. You can find me on TikTok and Instagram mainly. Neuroqueering dot nutrition. I had to change it. It used to be underscore. I think it's dot. I'm really bad at that. I'll
I'll
put it
set
in the show
I'll
notes.
search it.
But I'm a very inconsistent social media poster because,
Same.
single parent, 2 kids, PhD working, and executive functioning differences. So I really love watching other people that post consistently and have these really lovely themed, presentation styles. But it is actually one of my goals is to get back onto making content particularly for TikTok, that's my preferred platform. I feel like I can just be more authentically myself there. But I'm hoping to start to share and some of the research that's been coming out lately and to help translate that. And I feel like that would be really helpful for people that are looking for to not only to make sense of their experience, but also to answer that question you asked previously around advocacy. So yes, watch this space. I have goals. It's been a little bit haphazard though lately. And I
Relatable.
don't have a website because that's on the to-do list as well.
Yes, go to all of those links. I'm not on TikTok. I still don't know how it works. And
Oh,
I know
come join us.
I waste way too much time doom scrolling on Instagram, especially with the election right now. Oh my goodness. If you're
Oh
listening
my
to
gosh,
this,
I've
yeah,
cried many times
me too.
last week or so. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
If you are
awful.
listening to this, this episode has come out the week after the US federal election. We all know what that means. I don't want to dwell too much on it, but we are with you. It is very scary for everybody. It's not just the US. This will have effects to everybody. If
It
you
already is
are,
having effects in Australia here.
I know. If you are feeling scared, if you're feeling worried, anxious, we get it. You're allowed. That is totally natural. I would be surprised if you weren't. Someone just rang the doorbell in this middle of this very emotional sentence. Apologies. It is really scary. But do whatever you need to keep yourself safe in the next few weeks, especially, and just feel everything. If you've had slip ups, if you've had relapses, that's totally okay. Just get back on the wagon if you need to. Take some time. It's been a very stressful time. So,
Yeah.
and we
Yeah.
will not stop shutting up about healthcare because healthcare is politics, and more
I'm
so
so
than
glad you
ever.
said that because I feel very, very strongly about the fact that all healthcare
It's
is
political.
political.
Absolutely, it is.
And eating disorders in particular are
Yes.
very much a politically contested space. So,
Yes. So
um,
we will not stop shutting up about this. And yeah, I'm no longer on X, Twitter, whatever the hell it's called. I got rid of that because I'm like, I'm just not going. It wasn't going anywhere good anyway. I was only on there for wrestling Twitter anyway. But but yeah, so we will still be here shouting as much as we can, and we won't stop. So yes, just again tangent, but be kind to yourselves at this time. Yes, TikTok, that's where we were. Yeah, I'm not on TikTok. But actually, spoiler for the next episode coming, I'm inviting on a researcher to talk about the effects TikTok has on people with eating disorders and how it can impact our negative body image, which with a new study that came out recently. So watch this space. I may not know anything about TikTok, but the person I'm inviting on does. So
yeah, yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
stay tuned
And
for
I think,
that.
oh, that's going to be so interesting because I think that, like, I love TikTok, but I'm also very aware because I'm on there. I am aware how damaging it can be.
Yeah.
And so, how do we support like appropriate engagement is challenging. I'll
Yeah.
be listening in.
Yes. Watch this space.
Yeah.
Anna, thank you so much. Oh my goodness. I could talk to you for hours, as I already have proven that we can. It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so, so much, especially for giving up so much of your time. And I'm sure we'll be talking to you again.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed our conversation and thank you for following me on those tangents.
It was fun. We went on a journey, and I'm so happy
We
we
did.
did. Thanks for coming with us, everybody. That's all for today's podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode. And if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps with our analytics and getting this into other people's feeds. You can follow us on YouTube and Instagram at pavewithgoldpod. Send us an email at pavewithgoldpod@gmail.com or visit our website pavewithgoldpodcast.com. All of those links in the show notes with resources and where you can find Anna. Go there if you're not driving. And until next time, stay safe and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye. This podcast is general in nature and has not taken your personal circumstances or medical history into account. We are here to share our own experiences and the things that we have found helpful throughout our own personal recovery journeys. Please remember that each person's journey and circumstances are different, and not all of the information contained in this podcast may be relatable to you. It's important you consult your own GP or recovery team to seek out tailored advice before making any important decisions relating to your own health and recovery process. If you have found any of the content in this episode distressing, please contact your care team or a medical professional. If you or someone you know is in crisis and needs help now, please contact emergency services in your region immediately.